Well, thanks for joining the two of us to talk about Iran. I think the last few days have been a bit of a blur, and Farzan, you've been a expert on Iranian history and politics for a very long time. I think the purpose of what this live stream is meant to do is to try to understand better. Have we opened up a Pandora's box? Um, are there lanes in which some sort of stable transition to democracy could happen? How do you think about this? How do you assess this?
Hmm. That's a good question. We in the case of Iran, we've had multiple crises over the years, especially rounds of mass anti-regime protests, going back to obviously 2009, and then again 2007, 2018, 2019, Women Life Freedom Movement in 2022, and then the most recently, what's coming to be called the Lion and Sun Uprising in 2026. And I often would get asked, is regime change about to happen? And the same thing happened during the 12-day war in the past summer in June. Reflecting on Iranian history, my answer was typically no, right? And that's based on kind of reflecting on maybe the last century or so, the history of the modern Iranian state. When you look at moments of rupture, when you either had regime change or the existing regime transformed in certain fundamental names. So it was technically the same regime, but its nature changed. There was usually 3 or 4 factors at play. The first factor, of course, and the one everyone thinks of, is kind of a mass popular uprising. But of course, oftentimes, actually, mass popular uprisings haven't worked or haven't been sufficient. And it's kind of easy to understand. For anyone who's either done military training, been in the military, been in some form of the security forces, Tim, you've done a lot of kind of war coverage. A small group of well-organized, well-disciplined, ideologically motivated fighters can suppress and control a much far larger population of disorganized, unarmed people. And so oftentimes, especially when we're dealing with authoritarian contexts out of Iran, popular uprisings fail and they get crushed. So even in the Islamic Revolution of 1979, right, which everyone thinks as this grand kind of uprising where popular wave overthrew the regime, you actually have 2 things that have to happen before the popular uprising can succeed, right? The first is that the Shah of Iran essentially surrenders. He doesn't want to commit a wide-scale massacre of people, and he's quite ill at the time, so he decides to step down and leave the country. That obviously rarely happens, right? Where the kind of top level leadership of a regime just surrenders. But of course, he left in place what was supposed to be a constitutional monarchy with the hope that that would help the pathway to transition. The army, which was kind of the guardian of that constitutional monarchy, they declared neutrality in relation to political forces, right? And so that in the critical moment, the revolutionary forces, without having the army or the other security forces as an encumbrance, basically were able to seize power. That's quite the exception in Iranian history. Actually, typically what you see are 2 other important factors which kind of contribute to some form of regime change. And when we're thinking of it in a more contemporary context, hopefully a regime change that's headed towards democracy. Right? The second factor is obviously we've kind of alluded to it. We talked about it a little bit, and what's happening now is foreign intervention, specifically foreign military intervention. That's actually often a key factor. And a third factor is defection of political elites and or the loss of their control over security forces, right? I kind of said this after the 12-day wars this summer. Since then, we basically had 2 of those boxes checked, right? We had a popular uprising, which in the context of the modern kind of Iranian state, especially since the Islamic Revolution in 1979, is more or less unprecedented in scale and in terms of as an effort to overthrow the Islamic Republic. And that's why you saw a wide-scale massacre, right? And that triggered this large-scale military intervention that we're seeing now. That's 2 out of those 3 hypothetical boxes checked, right? That leaves a third box, which is, do elites start to defect? And defection can, play out in a few ways. Do they abandon their posts? Do they actually join the opposition? Or do they reach out to foreign adversaries to declare their willingness to work as part of a transition? And or do they start to lose their control of the security forces? That's the moment we're in right now. We're in the thick of it. And so it's a little bit hard to tell if that third box will be checked. But I think that's going to be important.
Are you seeing any indications at all, or are you seeing a rally around the flag approach among regime elites, essentially doubling down on their existing position due to foreign strikes.
In terms of elites, so far it appears that elites are rallying. Now, is the broader populace rallying? I think that's a different, slightly more complicated story. But elites are rallying. We do see some signs of possible defections on the margins. For example, when the protests started, we had two senior diplomats, one here in Geneva, where I am, and one in Vienna, defect and seek asylum in Switzerland. So we've had some defections at the mid level, some defections at the lower levels. We started getting some videos, especially in recent days, of members of the security forces basically saying that our commanders have abandoned us and we're ready to fight for a change. That tends to be at the low to mid end of the spectrum, and we're not necessarily seeing it reach any kind of critical mass. Part of that, of course, could be that Iran is experiencing an internet blackout, right? And it's done deliberately by the state for various security related reasons, specifically to block potential signs of kind of mass defections happening. So it's very possible that in this digital blackout conditions, something is happening, especially as the U.S. and Israel, and especially Israel, are hounding the domestic security forces and the military more broadly. It's just very difficult to see. But at the moment, it seems that at least at the level of the elites, they move very quickly to make sure there wasn't any kind of prolonged power vacuum. And so at least during this first week of the war, they seem to be fairly strongly ensconced still in power.
Well, it's hard to believe it's been less than a week, actually. And we just
Yeah.
jumped into this conversation. I love it. But we didn't give you a chance to introduce yourself and your Substack
That's
and
right.
your great work and your announcement. Why don't we do that now that we've gotten
Of
all
course.
warmed?
Of course, of course. So my name is Farzan Sabed. I'm a managing researcher at the Sanctions and Sustainable Peace Hub at the Geneva Graduate Institute. I have a background that spans academia, the policy and think tank world, government, the United Nations. Alongside my position at the Geneva Graduate Institute, I also work as a consultant for the private sector in the area of geopolitical risk. So that actually takes more of my time than my day job, especially these days. And my main areas of focus have been over the last kind of decade and a half or so: Middle East security and politics, economic sanctions, and nuclear non-proliferation.
What I'm hearing is that we're getting very, very expensive advice here for free in the Substack Live. Uh,
Hopefully, hopefully.
uh, I'm Tim Mak, and those of you who don't know me, I have spent the last few years in Kyiv, Ukraine, running a publication called The Counteroffensive, which tries to cover and report on the war between Russia and Ukraine from a human interest perspective. So we tell you about someone, teach you about someone as a way to tell you the news. And when the war started with Iran, uh, less than a week ago, we decided to jump into action and try to cover it obsessively. And so now we have a publication called Iran War Dispatches at iranwar.news. And so if you're watching, you should be checking out IranWar.news. You should be checking out Farzan's um, IranWonk. It's really easy and free to subscribe and follow along, given how important these types of developments are to world affairs. But moving back, Farzan, to whether there's some level of or a great level of hubris in the American action in Iran. I wonder how you assess the likelihood of a worse outcome than the status quo, as opposed to something that could really be a liberating moment for the people of Iran.
Yeah, there's a big part of the discussion has been in kind of the public sphere, and I'm sure you've seen this as well, is that we don't really have very many cases or really any solid cases of regime change achieved purely through air war, right? Of which there isn't a major ground component. And I think if you reflect historically, that's more or less true, right? The kind of distinction being that you also don't have very many wars, especially modern wars, where the entire defense leadership or most of the defense and leadership, including the top leader of a country, is decapitated in the opening day, right? As much as this kind of general observations about air war and regime change remain true, Iran, of course, there's a broader context to it, which is, for example, it's been under sanctions for roughly 47 years. It's been under very kind of intense form of post 9/11 sanctions for the better part of 2 decades. And so the economy is weakened. That's one of the factors that triggered the mass uprising. The Iranian currency is crashing. It's very possible we'll see the Iranian rial hit 2 million rial to a dollar. Just to give you some context, in 1979, it was 79 or 70 rial, sorry, to $1. It's kind of 1.5 million or a little bit above 1.5 million. It might reach 2 million. So the currency is rapidly depreciating. Obviously, that affects imports. That affects inflation, people's ability to just afford basic goods. So Iranians are experiencing a rapid decline of living standards, and it's partly a function, of course, of those economic sanctions, but economic mismanagement and corruption also plays some role there. So that's kind of one of the economic situation which has been deteriorating. And of course, for any regime, you need to be able to pay off your elites and your social base, and of course your security forces. And so its ability to do that is declining rapidly. It was declining rapidly before the 12-day war in the summer. It accelerated after the 12-day war, and it's gotten worse since. And with this current world war, it's going to get even worse. Also, in terms of these anti-regime demonstrations, it's actually become a structural and cyclical problem. The first protests within these themes happened in, like I said, December 2017, January 2018. Then again, November 2019. Then again, Women, Life, Freedom in 2022. This is the fourth one. So that on average, you're having one major kind of anti-regime uprising every 2 years, and they're growing in scale. They're growing in terms of the kind of geographical coverage and social and demographic coverage, and they're becoming more violent and more threatening to the regime, right? So keeping in mind, on the one hand, these kind of two trend lines, on the other hand, the security crisis in the country, the fact that the Islamic Republic, that the ruling regime can't secure the country, and finally, the fact that, let's say they survive this war. And I think it's quite likely that if this ends up being a 2-3 week war, President Trump at some point looks for an off ramp. The regime does, they put a new leader, they do survive. The problem is that the type of person who's likely to come in and become leader, and the type of regime that will be left at the end of this, will not be able to offer any kind of positive horizon to Iranian society, absent full capitulation to the U.S. And Israel, which is what they're demanding right now. Taking together this kind of big picture, I think even if some kind of either change of the regime or a transformation of the current regime doesn't happen in the next few days or weeks, if we put this as a kind of a part of a longer term process that could take months, maybe a year or 2 years, I think we're certainly on that track. And so it will happen sooner or later. But it's quite possible that at least in the interim, the shorter term, that the regime that emerges from this war, if this ends up being kind of a shorter war in the 2, 3, 4 week range, might actually be radicalized and much more hardline than even into the preceding.
Do you think it would be naive to cheer on the fall of the regime, given that it's possible that whatever comes next is much worse? Or do you think that, the requirements of justice and the massacres of protesters lean you towards against, supporting the removal of these people?
I think regime change would be the best thing for Iran. I'll say that quite openly. And part of that is because, again, the regime, at least in its current form, can't really offer any positive horizon. And the economy has obviously been deteriorating for a long time. Part of the way they tried to legitimize themselves, the ruling system, over the last few years, especially from roughly 2015 onward, with this kind of anti-Islamic State campaign, was to actually do it on the basis of national security, to say, okay, we can't provide your great economic living standards, we can't provide your political freedoms and social freedoms. So this promise that we would reform could provide you those freedoms, we're not living up to those promises. But look at neighboring countries like Iraq, Syria. They're unstable. They can't provide you security, right?
Well, that's
Uh,
that is, of course, the quagmire in the Middle East. And what I'd be keen to hear from you is an overview of the sectarian tensions that may exist in Iran that possibly are being held down by a very brutal regime.
yeah, listen. If when we talk about kind of the social divisions, right? Uh, a large majority of the population are, if we're talking about, let's say, religion, right? Let's start with that dimension and we can move on to other dimensions. A large percent of the population are Shia Muslims. Hypothetically, that's maybe 80 to 90%. and a small minority are Sunni and kind of other religious backgrounds. Of course, that 80-90% Shia majority, many of those are lapsed Shia. So people who are secular, maybe they've even become kind of anti-religious because of the experience of living under a theocracy, right? Now, Iran's kind of demographic makeup in terms of, let's say, the ethno-linguistic makeup is much more complex, right? So, for example, we one of the main categories when we talk about who is the demographic majority in Iran, they talk about this idea of Persians, right? Persian in Iran, it's not really an ethnic category; it's a linguistic category, right? You actually very rarely have it people inside of Iran identify as Persian. I'm from the province that's called Persia, right? We never called ourselves Persian. We identify, for example, based on our city. Also, the ethnic group that my family comes from, they're technically non-Persian. They spoke another group before they assimilated and started speaking Persian, right? If you look at who is a Persian speaker, you have people who, in my own family, I have people who are tall, blue eyes, blonde hair. They speak Persian. I have people who are Afro-Iranians from the south of the country who speak Persian. I have Asiatic kind of looking family members who are also considered kind of Persian speakers. But Persian speakers, as a very kind of broad category, make up a majority, maybe 50 to 60%. Then there's other groups. Lur is a kind of a bacteria, and Lur is a kind of a one group. They're kind of historically were a pastoralist group. Then there's people from these kind of northern region. They don't really have any nationalist or state building projects, and the kind of ethnic tensions with them are kind of limited, right? So let's say that those populations, which make up a lot of the core of the state, might be like something like 2/3. The big ethnic ethno-linguistic groups, right? That potentially could have tensions with other groups and potentially have, let's say, sectarian projects within them, or maybe among some part of that population, and decide to either create an independent state or join another state. There's two or three main groups. So the first group are called Azerbaijanis, which are kind of Turkic speaker in the northwest of the country. Again, the complexity there is that, for example, if I had to talk about some of the biggest Iranian nationalists that I knew, most of them are actually Azerbaijanis, and they speak Persian with a Turkic like accent, right? Actually, a lot of Iran's senior leadership, including Ayatollah Khamenei, who was assassinated recently, comes from a Turkic background. So there you have, for example, some cities like Tabriz, where there's a part of the population that would be interested, for example, in either joining the Republic of Azerbaijan and creating their own state. But the broader population either identifies politically and in terms of identity, either more with Shiism or more with the broader nationality. With Kurds, you have a kind of a similar breakdown, although you have a bigger part of the population within the Kurdish-speaking population that identifies as kind of pan-Kurdish nationalists. So you have this Kurdish coalition that recently emerged. They kind of unified all these big parties. They represent kind of a big single ideological trend, which is pan-Kurdish nationalism, where they either on one end of the spectrum seek autonomy or federalism within the state, and on the other end of the spectrum, some would seek independence and union with potentially creation of a greater Kurdish state. Again, within Kurdish society, you have divisions, right? So this part of the Kurds are, I think, so Azerbaijanis, I think, are seen as making something like a quarter of the population. Kurds are seen as making something like maybe 10%, although we don't have very accurate, updated ethno-linguistic statistics. The Kurdish population, I would say you could roughly divide it in half between Sunni and Shia speakers. Maybe these pan-Kurdish nationalist political current and this Kurdish coalition could represent anywhere as much as half. But if you look at the other part of Kurdish speakers, many of them, for example, are Shia, and they identify with the current regime of the current state. If you look at actually in the Kurdish-speaking areas, or who's doing the repression, oftentimes it's Kurdish speakers. And then you have others who are kind of Iranian nationalists. So you have these tensions, especially and then you have Balochis, there's kind of a similar story there. Right. So these are sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. We've heard rumors of denials of the Americans arming and encouraging Kurdish militias to rise up. How credible do you see these reports? And how much of a challenge would it be to the regime's authority?
I don't find them very credible, personally. It's possible that it's a form of kind of psychological warfare. Because a lot of the reporting you see gives the impression that this is kind of an operation that's been in preparation for a long time. Well, then why would you kind of announce it on CNN in advance, first of all, right? Especially if you're pounding the Islamic public security apparatus, and they might not see it coming, right? So that's kind of the first signal to me. And looking at kind of the Persian sources and some of the Kurdish sources that I usually read, there was no sense that there was some kind of buildup happening, right? Now it's possible that since these protests started, they began that process. So it might be a relatively recent effort. I'm not quite sure if any kind of offensive is in preparation. In terms of, let's say I'm wrong and this operation happens in the coming days or weeks, right? What are its chances of success? Well, the historical pattern we see, and this is again going back like a century within the kind of modern history of the Iranian state, as long as those forces have the backing of foreign powers, in a case of, for example, large scale air cover, right, like a no-fly zone, they can achieve some operational successes, although they typically lack heavy weapons. But at least with close air support and kind of air cover of the U.S. military, the Israeli military, they might be able to make advances. The issue for this, for example, Kurdish coalition, or for example, the Baluchis, who also have a kind of a organized a guerrilla group, is that once that foreign backing is withdrawn, they typically lack the political and military muscle to hold ground without the active engagement of that kind of foreign intervention. And we've seen this a little bit also, this dynamics in Syria, right? Where you had this SDF, which was a fairly competent fighting force, but as soon as the US withdrew its support for it, they were forced to kind of negotiate and come to terms with Ahmed al-Shara. And the last I saw, they were part of a process of being integrated into the state rather than carving out their own, for example, federal or autonomous. So I think it's the same in Iran. These types of groups especially in the periphery of the country, they typically just lack the muscle. Now, one scenario in which they could have some success is potentially linking up with either defecting units or defectors within the regime, but also the linking up with the kind of the leading opposition force in the core of the country. So if the periphery can work with the core, it might have some shot of achieving successes. But by itself, once the foreign intervention is withdrawn, typically collapses.
Well, these scenarios that you're outlining all involve an American and Israeli quagmire in this country. It is not an in and out 72-hour operation. It is a long-term period under which, if you make these sorts of demands for regime change, you either have to achieve that or you have to go away looking powerless.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, once you enter this conflict, especially with a regime like this that has such a high level of resolve, right? And that's not going back down very easily. There's this risk that you get drawn in further and further and further, and you at least have to make some form of sustained commitment, right? Because imagine, let's say there's an off ramp that President Trump takes in the coming weeks, right? 1, 2, 3 weeks. Well, if the succession is towards a hardline leadership, which is not willing to compromise with the United States, you have every reason to, for example, potentially believe that any red lines they had of trying to break out for a nuclear weapon. So we understand that they had been developing the various elements of a weapon, but hadn't made a decision to actually build and test a weapon. Well, that's out the door now, right? And so that actually becomes a greater concern. And so and you kind of get pulled into this dynamic, right? This trap where now you've really pissed them off. Now, whatever, maybe they weren't immediately trying to build a bomb before this war, but now you have every reason to believe they either may or they are doing it. And so you're forced to maintain kind of an ongoing level of commitment. And so that's why, again, in my view, it comes down, obviously, the U.S. at this juncture, at least, I could not see them committing more than limited ground forces, for example, for special forces raids, or you have this fat island where Iran's main oil export terminal is, which is the kind of a lifeline for the national economy, right? If Iran continues to go all out and try to damage regional energy infrastructure and the global energy market, the U.S. could decide to seize that, right? In that case, they would need kind of a limited force just to go on this island. So it's a relatively easy operation, but you've already had some forward mission crew. My sense is that the U.S. then at a later stage is not willing necessarily to do some kind of large scale Iraq-style invasion. So what ends up happening is we go back to that third box that I talked about, right? That you have to check for some kind of either substantive transformation of the regime or regime change, which is you need to connect the, let's say, more powerful elements of the opposition with defecting forces within the regime. And that can be at the level of political elites, but also at the level of the security forces in the military, right? And so to have the Iranians carry on the fight themselves. Of course, given the level of resolve of this political system, it's not one that bends or breaks very easily. You could see a protracted conflict emerging from that.
It's hard to believe it's only been 6 days since 6 full days since this has started. What's your bottom line on whether you believe that this will be a 3 or 4 week operation, or do you see the
Hmm.
hubris kind of American power coming in and pulling us into a quagmire?
So the 3 to 4 week kind of timeline, and that's from the start of the war, let's say, partly comes from the fact that in my private sector work, I engage with a lot of people from different backgrounds, open source intelligence experts, former U.S. government officials, former officials from kind of other countries, other governments. And so that's kind of the collective wisdom we come to. If I had to kind of say why I accept that timeline and kind of don't put something separate, is that it just the understanding I have of President Trump's condition. If he gets regime change, that would be ideal for him, probably. He said that before, but that's obviously not an easy 3 or 4 week operation, right? If he gets a or a new version of the same regime, which is when they capitulate and give him everything he wants, and there's domestic political reasons why that's not so easy for this regime to do. But let's just say hypothetically, right? He would accept. I think President Trump would be willing to accept that as long as it was clear this capitulatory regime was somehow trustworthy. That's kind of a second layer. That's a non-domestic issue problem of the scenario, right? But if ideally, in his view, if or ideally is a regime change, but if he got the scenario, it would be acceptable. And this is kind of what people talk about when they talk about the Venezuela kind of scenario or regime modification. And then, but if you can't get that again in 3 or 4 weeks, right? We've seen the Islamic Republic leadership moving to fill that authoritative vacuum at the top very quickly. Then I think, I could see President Trump at some point, the cost of the war going up. There's not much of a clear window of continuing the operations, which are quite costly indefinitely. So he becomes satisfied with the level of damage, both that he's done to the top levels of the regime and its kind of elite and leadership, but also severely degrading its military capacities, including the missile capacity, the drone capacity, the kind of industrial back end to that production and supply chains, in addition to, for example, the Iranian Navy, which has been severely degraded, right? At that point, he says, I killed Ayatollah Khamenei, who had tried to assassinate me and kill me, and who'd insulted America and was a threat. We've degraded the Islamic Republic's kind of military capacity, just like he, during the 12-Day War, he said we obliterated their nuclear program, right? So now we obliterated their military. And he uses that as an off-ramp. And as long as the Iranians do not continue to attempt to do large-scale attacks, then that type of tentative ceasefire can hold. But as I'm sure you're aware and you can kind of imagine, the risk that then we have more future rounds of these is quite high. And it's exactly that scenario that the Iranians hope to avoid by kind of expanding this conflict.
Marjan, I'm so grateful for your time. I wonder if you want to give one more plug for your Substack and make sure people know what you're doing and where you're located.
Sure, absolutely. So yeah, I'm based in Geneva, Switzerland. I write on my IranWonk Substack. Actually, I write a lot of things. I do a lot of media interviews. I don't consistently post them just because I'm doing these 2 or 3 different kind of projects and positions. I'm working to now more consistently update my Substack and add content. So IranWonk on Substack.
Well, I'm Tim Mak. We just launched a reporting publication which writes about the people of Iran as a way to illustrate this war. You can find that Substack at iranwar.news. Thanks so much, Farzan, and thanks so much for all the folks who are listening into this conversation. We'll see you soon.
Thanks a lot for having me.